You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Ed Conard. He is a New York Times best-selling author, visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and a former partner at Bain Capital. Ed, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Sure, thank you for having me.
So our topic for discussion today is Ed's latest book, The Upside of Inequality, How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class. We'll link to the book at the show notes page, economicsdetective.com/upside. Now, The Upside of Inequality is quite the provocative title, so what made you set out to defend inequality?
Well, the last book I wrote, which was called Unintended Consequences, Why Everything You've Been Told About the Economy is Wrong, was widely viewed as a defense of the 1%. And ironically, people who read it said, geez, it's not really about the 1%, it's about macroeconomics. But nevertheless, it was pigeonholed there, and everywhere I went, people wanted me to defend the 1%. And over the last 4 years, I've basically honed and defined and developed that defense. It's also an explanation, a macroeconomic explanation as well, and it just seemed like a logical arc for the book. I thought it would be a major theme in this election, and I was looking for a provocative title that would break through the noise, but I could have organized the book a number of different ways. I think one way to view it is a discussion about income inequality, but it's really about the modern economy and why it's different than the manufacturing economy we used to live in, and a lot of the economic beliefs that come from the prior economy that don't apply to this one.
I remember when Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, became a surprise hit. One of the issues Piketty didn't really address was why inequality was such a bad thing. He spent 700 pages discussing inequality, but sort of left out the bit where he would have made an argument that we should be concerned about this and we should take inequality seriously and take, he proposed very serious steps to reduce inequality even at the expense of economic growth, which seems like quite the position to take without first really justifying what it is we don't like about inequality and what level of inequality is acceptable or not acceptable. So it's nice to see the sort of other side of that argument, which is that inequality has, as the title says, an upside. So in your first chapter, you discuss the causes of growing inequality. Some explanations you point to are the size of the economy, the rise of information technology, and an increasing share of investments going to intangible assets. So starting with the size of the economy, how does that affect inequality?
Yeah, so I argue that in this modern information-based economy, you don't need much capital to scale to economy-wide success. And if you scale to that level, given that the world is bigger, you're going to be even bigger than you would have been in the past. So most workers are constrained by the number of customers they can serve. A school teacher can only teach so many students. A doctor can only see so many patients. A waitress can only serve so many customers, but many businesses today, whether it's Google or Facebook or Taylor Swift, all of them can reach the entire global economy. I think of it as economy-wide success. It doesn't have to be global. They can do that with very little need for capital, and when they do it, they're going to be much bigger than they were in the past when the economy today is much, much larger than it was. So it has a couple of different effects. One is that their success is much bigger relative to the median worker, just like a company today is generally much bigger than the median worker. The second is that they can get there without having to share much of the value with investors. And a third thing that's very, very important and goes throughout the book is it leaves savings sitting on the sideline unused, and that slows growth in the economy, which largely affects the middle and working class.
So another one of the things you mention is the rise of information technology, or I think the technical term would be skill-biased technical change. Do you see that as a major contributor to inequality?
Yeah, I do, because I think it requires very little capital in that economy to scale up to economic-wide success, you don't have to share the value that you're able to capture from your innovation with investors. If you think about Henry Ford, Ford Motor Company, or Edison with the electric companies, it took an enormous amount of capital, inventory, et cetera, to get to economy-wide scale. And that means you have to say whatever value is captured by the innovators and the investors, you have to share that with a wide base of investors. Today, you can get a lot of success. Many companies very successful without really needing any investors at all. So you look at the Facebooks and Googles of the world, for example, they're basically cash flow positive, but not right at the beginning, but soon afterwards. And all the way from there to economy-wide success, they're actually generating cash along the way. So they need no investors at all. Many of these companies go public for no other reason than the value, the stake of the original owners. And so when innovators are able to capture a larger share of the value because they don't need investors, the outside success of that group is going to be significantly bigger than it was in the past. It's a greater share of the economy.
Right. So something like Google, which is now one of the biggest companies in the world, was really just an algorithm. They just had a better search algorithm than the next guys. And an algorithm is not a factory. It is really just something someone comes up with in their head and needs no tangible investment. And it can pay off billions, as we've seen with something like Google.
And I think what you need is two things there, and this is what I argue are the new constraints to growth. One thing you need is properly trained talent, and the second thing you need is a willingness and capacity to take risk, in that case, entrepreneurial risk. And that those are now the constraints to growth, where previously the constraint would have been more akin to savings. You just needed a lot of savings to fund the capital to scale up and to grow the economy and to increase the capital per worker in order to drive up productivity and wages. But now we see that savings sitting on the sideline unused. You have a zero interest rate. It still doesn't put the capital to work, which means we must be bumping up against other constraints to growth. Argue those constraints, properly trained talent and risk-taking. And properly trained talent is an aspect of risk-taking. It's a very kind of abstract concept because the more talented workers I have, the more likely I am to find good ideas, great ideas, which are lower risk to implement because of the quality of the ideas and the likelihood of them succeeding. And the second thing is that they can commercialize those ideas more effectively. And as a result, they reduce the risk of having a good idea and trying to bring it to market. So I think if you look at something like Facebook, it's not a unique idea. It simply was implemented far more effectively than all the alternatives, which were very, very, very similar.
Right. I believe there was an article from 10 or 15, maybe not 15, a while ago. Somebody wrote an article arguing that Myspace was a natural monopoly. This was slightly before the rise of Facebook. And it just kind of shows that these idea firms are really in cutthroat competition with each other, even if they look very large and impregnable, you can get a lot of competition.
I mean, you have Facebook, Instagram in some ways is a major threat to Facebook. Facebook was able to buy Instagram, but Snapchat is now a major competitor to Instagram. And you see the kids migrating down. You see older people staying at Facebook. You see kind of the middle group switching to Instagram, and you see the youngest kids are all now on Snapchat moving away. In some ways, it would be logical for a company to control the whole chain from taking a picture, throwing most of them away, keeping a timeline on Instagram, and ultimately writing some words to go along with the picture on Facebook. And obviously, Facebook's very, very interested in Snapchat, but from a competitive standpoint, far better to have those three companies and let them build the whole chain upwards and downwards around them and get three competitors instead of one competitor in that space.
I guess one relevant aspect of this, I don't remember this statistic, but when you look at a lot of successful entrepreneurs, the Steve Jobses of the world, they usually have one or two failures and bankruptcies under their belt before they hit the one that's successful. So that's the kind of willingness to take risks that you're talking about?
Well, I just think that what happens is success, like the Steve Jobs of the world or Facebook's or Google, they bubble up from a large pool of failure. And so there's a lot of people in Silicon Valley trying to start many different startups, and lots of people now in New York, for example, and many other cities who are trying to duplicate the success. And what they have is a kind of 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 lottery where it requires very little capital in order to succeed. If they succeed, they have the potential to scale up to economy-wide success and potentially get very, very rich. And you've seen a mushrooming of risk-taking because of the characteristics of innovation today relative to what it looked like in a capital-intensive economy. And so even though there's a lot of luck, there's surely a lot of luck involved in which one succeeds and which one fails. What you ultimately need is this big pool of failures to drive that. And the other things I say in the book is that it's not talented individuals taking risk, because they're also working inside of institutions that greatly, greatly magnify the likelihood of their success and the value of their success. So they work at companies like Google and Facebook that give them better on-the-job training. They coalesce into synergistic communities of experts like Silicon Valley or Wall Street or the auto industry in Detroit or the oil industry in Texas. There are different communities like this. They coalesce into these synergistic communities of experts, which make them have much more access to the talented teams that they need to make their ideas successful. You get people like the Elon Musks of the world and the Peter Thiels of the world in venture capital that really have inside knowledge. They end up with the equity. They're much more skillful investors of their equity than outside investors who don't really understand the technology would be. That leads to, if you're in Greece trying to come up with a good idea, what's the probability that you're going to be successful, as opposed to you're at Google, you have your eureka moment. You really know that you have a good idea and access to a team of friends and a network that can help you make that idea work. It's no surprise that those are the people who are willing to take the risk because they have good ideas that have a higher probability of success and a higher chance for payoff than what you're going to find in other places of the world, where you're going to see a lot less risk-taking because the payoffs are amplified by these institutional capabilities. And so naturally in the United States, you see many more people willing to get the training and pursue the career and trying to satisfy customer needs more effectively than competitors. And it leads to a faster growth in the institutional capabilities over the last 25 years, say, what we've seen in the United States, that has really given the United States a differential advantage relative to the rest of the world. And so ultimately you have to look at what is the speed, what's the growth rate of these institutional capabilities, and what effect do they have on the productivity of your most talented workers. And we've seen enormous differentiation between the United States and Europe and Japan on this critical dimension to success. I always think it's dangerous to simply look at the individuals and think that it's simply a matter of that's the only piece of the equation that matters, because ultimately all of this risk-taking, payoffs for success, probability of success, ultimately they lead to this organic building of these capabilities.
I can see where the inequality story comes in here, because if you have 100 or 1,000 failures, and for every one huge runaway success, you've got your failures dragging down the income distribution at the bottom and your successes pulling it up at the top, I can see how that would contribute to inequality.
I think the failures really pull what you see on the failures. Keep in mind, these are highly skilled people. They end up at the 95th percentile and then instead of the 99th, 0.9th percentile. But if you really look at where the growth has been, they keep slicing and slicing off the top. It's not the 1%, it's the 0.1%. It's really not the 0.1%, it's the 0.01%. It's like, yes, in this world where you have this 1 in 1,000 chance of succeeding and you've got a lot of people trying, what that's going to do is push out the tail of the distribution. And when you slice off the farthest end of the tail, you're going to find the Steve Jobs and such who've been highly, highly successful because of the economics of success in the current set of investment opportunities that we have, which are largely information based. And so even if the returns are lousy, even if it's not a good idea for people to enter these lotteries, just the fact that you can achieve the success without needing investors is going to cause more people to take to play the lottery, and it's going to drive out the tail, and ultimately it's going to lead to these outsized successes where if you just keep slicing off further and further out the tail, eventually you're going to find the manifestation of the economics that this economy faces today relative to the kind of economics we saw in the 1930s or the 1950s.
So that's what's happening in the sort of high risk, high reward segments of the economy. But you also address what's happening in the sort of conventional economy, we might think of it as low risk, low reward, but the old factory jobs, the kind of things that have been around since the 1950s, maybe. You argue that trade shocks and low-skilled immigration have depressed wages of native-born, low-skilled workers. In particular, you say that David Card's famous study that appeared to show that the Mariel boat lift failed to suppress wages in Miami is unconvincing. So why do you find that study unconvincing, and what do you find more convincing about the effects of immigration?
I'll try to say several things here. First, I'm not against immigration. It's the ratio of high to low-skilled immigration that matters. And I'm not against trade. You can't make for $20 what you can buy for $2 and think you're going to be competitive in the long run. My beef is with trade deficits, which return a lot of risk-averse savings to the U.S., and we know the savings are sitting unused with a zero interest rate. And that, I believe, has led to, trade deficits, we'll get into this, but was 5.5% of GDP prior to the financial crisis. It's destabilized our financial system, probably led to a panic that we could have avoided, has led to 8 years of slow growth as savings has on the sideline. But I tell the following story, which I think starts to explain the problem, which is I was a manufacturing engineer at Ford. And I spent my whole career working in manufacturing, and we move a plant to Mexico, and we tell the workers, don't worry, the entrepreneurs are coming. They're going to put you back to work. They're going to compete with each other, drive up your wages. They're going to have to increase your productivity. Look at the capital sitting on the sideline with zero interest rate. They're going to borrow the money. They're going to increase the capital per worker to drive your productivity up. That's going to increase your wages. Meanwhile, that worker says, wait a second, the entrepreneurs, the talented risk takers, all moved to California, and they outsourced all their blue-collar work to China. Meanwhile, the manufacturing engineers that are left behind are now making products and designing factories for Mexican workers. Where is the talented risk taker who's coming to put me back to work? And what we see is that the wages in those communities stay depressed for decades. This is the David Otter work, and it's not like entrepreneurs are rushing to Indiana to put these workers back to work, as you would expect if there wasn't a shortage, if we weren't banging up. My book says that that's one of the constraints. These are the two constraints to growth. And that worker as well says, and wait a second, when I go waiting for that entrepreneur to put me back to work, what I find is 40 million foreign-born adults, 20 million native-born adult children from those 40 million adults, 20 million children from those 60 million adults. That's 80 million people, 55 million of which are Hispanic immigrants who are on average lower skilled than the American workforce. And all of those workers are looking for the same pool of entrepreneurs and risk takers to also drive their wages back up as well. And I believe that has an effect on the marginal product of labor. Now, it isn't immigration per se that's the problem. It's the ratio between high and low skilled immigration. And I would say, you look forward into the future and you see two big problems that you got to solve. One is that retiring baby boomers eat us alive. We're at state, local, and federal spending 36% of GDP. The CBO expects it to go up 9 points, federal spending to rise 9 points, 9 percentage points of GDP over the next 30 years as baby boomers retire. That's 45% of GDP. And so you go, we're not going to solve this problem. And debt, by the way, goes from 30 to 35% prior to the recession, 75% of GDP today, forecasted to go to 140%. And keep in mind, this is cutting discretionary spending to levels we all know we're never really going to cut it to. So the numbers are actually bigger than that, but that's how the CBO calculates the numbers. So you look out there and you say, you get two big problems, right? One is you're not going to get there with organic growth. And so one of the things the book says is that you got 100 million workers. The top 5% is 5 million. We ought to try to double that 5% and try to double our growth rate. I don't know if there's synergistic effects, 1 + 1 is more than 2, or you're fishing into a fished out pool of opportunities, and so 1 + 1 gets you less than 2. But I think that can have a significant impact on growth. The second problem, I think, is you can't make for $20 what you can buy for $2 and be competitive in the long run. So you have to trade, and you have to trade with low wage economies. It's really no different than innovation. Anything that lowers the cost of goods of a product is going to be valuable. I do think we have to recognize, though, that the worker who, keep in mind, even in balanced trade, okay, we're selling high-skilled labor, Apple operating systems, we're buying low-wage, low-skilled labor, Chinese, Mexican workers. So even in balanced trade, we would be putting pressure on lower-skilled workers' wages. Ultimately, though, that worker, if you couldn't find work that was more valuable than the now lower cost of goods, those goods wouldn't be cheaper. So we know that trade is going to be beneficial to the United States, but it is probably the case that the worker who suffers the wage pressure from that, okay, is paying 100% of the cost, getting about a third of the benefits or less. Retirees who don't work are getting benefits. Some of the poor who don't work are getting the benefits. The top 20% who account for 50% of the income are getting about half the benefits. So, the worker is disproportionately bearing the cost relative to the benefits that worker is capturing. But I think the most important thing in this is we can't forego free trade and think we're going to be successful in the long run. But when we run up large trade deficits, okay, in that case, we buy a product from China or Germany or Japan, all have very high savings rates, not less so Japan today as they're retiring. Mexico, it's really more corporate savings than it is individual savings. But in each case, we buy a product from Germany, we give them their dollars. Rather than buying a product that employs our workers, they loan us the dollars back, largely by buying T-bills. And people who were low risk-averse savers who would have bought T-bills are now pushed into the private sector and largely deposit their money in the bank and say, I'll fund an investment provided that I don't have to take the risk. So that money is now sitting there, the corn in the silo, if you will, unused, and we have zero interest rate. Now let's look at all the different effects of this. The first dollar of trade is really, really valuable, right? The last dollar of trade is probably break even. That's why it's the last dollar. Trade is 16% of GDP would be imports, 13% of GDP today. There's about 3.5% trade deficit, but let's just say 13, round it to 3 to make it simple. So by the time you get 13/16 of the way to break even, how close are you to break even? Pretty darn close. And if there's a curve, you're probably all the way to break even at 13. What happens at 13? We start running trade deficit. And at that point, from 13 to 16, somebody loses their job unless somebody takes the risk of borrowing the money and putting it back to work. We know people aren't taking the risk because the interest rate is zero. No one's putting the money back to work. I argue that risk-taking, our capacity and willingness to take risk, is one of the binding constraints to growth, and that's why the money sits unused. So unless we put that money back to work, now let's look at what's happened. Germany has a lot of savings. What did they do with it? They loaned it to Greece for consumption that Greece is never going to pay back. What's China doing with their incremental dollar? They're building cities full of empty apartment buildings that will probably be obsolete before they ever get full. What did the U.S. do with their excess savings? A lot of it came from the trade deficit, where, keep in mind, savings are about 2.5%, 3% of GDP. At trade deficit, it's 3.5% of GDP today. It was about 5.5% prior to the crisis. So it's a significant contributor to this problem of excess savings, that if we don't put those savings back to work, we get slow growth, high unemployment, and low wage. This is the lesson that Keynes taught us. It's an important lesson. And so we look at the cost of the incremental 3 points of trade. Those costs are quite high to workers. And if you look back in time, what do you see? One thing you see is that it led to a huge increase in subprime mortgages and subprime consumption, which seemed to be unsustainable in the long run. Maybe it could be at a higher level than it is today. But all of that money flowing into our banking system, indirectly by flowing into T-bills and pushing people who would have bought T-bills into the banking system, destabilized our banking system, probably led to the financial crisis, ultimately has led to 8 years of slow growth, high unemployment, low wages, which we're beginning to see some recovery. So the cost of this is enormous. And I understand the other side of the argument, which I say in the book. Do you want to take a shot of mononucleosis, the malaria, to cure a cold or to cure mononucleosis? I'm not sure we want to give politicians power over trade. Okay? And I'm not sure, because we're all scared of that. And we also have to worry that the economic circumstances, are constantly evolving. If we're a manufacturing-based economy, we might need the savings. We might be savings constrained because it's very capital intensive. We're not in that economy today. Next year, we might need nuclear fusion to solve global warming, and it might be massively capital intensive, and we want to run large trade deficits. Now, I suspect what we're going to discover is that if the world gets capital intensive, people aren't going to want to give us their savings anymore, and we're not going to be running trade deficits. But we do have to worry. I should just step back and say what my proposal is, which is for every dollar of exports, we issue a dollar of import licenses. We allow those licenses to trade freely. They should probably trade pretty close to zero to the extent they have any value. That should increase the amount of exports a little bit, decrease the amount of imports a little bit. And instead of being at 16.5 and 13, we'd probably come out somewhere in the middle, probably closer to 13 than 16.5. But do we want to give politicians that control? There's going to be a real cost to that, to be sure. But there's a real cost to having these savings pile up in the economy that we're in, which is not a capital-intensive, savings-constrained economy. And so this is what I think is happening to the middle and working class.
I'm not so sure that that's a problem with the trade deficit per se. Couldn't it be more seen as a problem of monetary policy, pushing the interest rate down to zero?
Perhaps it could, but in my first book, I think there's people who believe that the Fed is all-powerful. I probably fall in the category of the Fed is a bit of the Wizard of Oz. It's a question of whether you think it's a price maker or a price taker. I think it's more of a price taker, and that the markets really do determine what the price is. And so I think of the Fed in the following way, which is it can put a brake on risk-taking. It can slow down an economy. What it can't do is accelerate risk-taking. What it can't do, it doesn't create savings. Okay, it's just an accounting firm. It can print some IOUs that sort of out of thin air. It can just print a few more IOUs that change the accounting, but doesn't actually produce anything. It doesn't create any savings. So what I said in the last book, Unintended Consequences, was that the Fed would try to stimulate growth by printing money, and that the money would sit unused, and that what we would end up with was slow growth and no inflation. That was my prediction, because we would bump into our willingness and capacity to take risk. And when we bump into that capacity, the money would sit unused and it wouldn't create growth. So I think, yes, do they control the overnight rate? Sure. But nobody's really investing based on the overnight rate. They're looking out to the 20, 30-year time horizon. So is there some belief that, the Fed will, the rates today, the low rates today, have some impact on the long-term rates? They probably have a very small impact on the long-term rates. But I think unless the Fed said, no matter what happens, I'm going to print money and I'm going to allow inflation whenever it comes, I will damage the economy sometime in the future. That might have some short-term stimulatory effect. I don't think that's the policy that the Fed has followed, nor is it the policy that anybody believes the Fed will follow, which is if we ever see signs of inflation, if capacity ever tightens, the Fed will immediately tighten up the monetary base and slow down the inflation rate. It won't actually ever inflict any damage in the future. And so it has, I believe, very little effect in the short run, unless you truly have the courage and the determination and the stupidity, perhaps, to actually inflict damage on the economy in the future. Then your threat today is motivational. But we have a history that except for being stupid, the Fed's been unwilling to inflict that kind of damage on the economy. And so if you don't have a credible threat today, what difference does it make whether you lower the overnight rate to zero? It will probably be close to zero anyway, no matter what. Many times they've announced they're going to increase, and the market's actually moved in the opposite direction. Because people are looking out long term and they're saying there is no use for these savings. These savings are going to sit unused for a long, long time. That's what the markets are telling us.
So I want to touch on a couple things you mentioned. There's David Otter's research that showed that trade shock with China in the early 2000s depressed wages and led to large unemployment in a lot of communities that lasted a very long time. 10 years later, those communities were still kind of destitute. And then there's, of course, the financial crisis. And of course, we know that's a housing bubble was a big part of the buildup to that. I see these as both being caused by the land use restrictions imposed at the local level in a lot of America's cities. You have these local governments restricting growth and densification of cities, and that makes the housing supply very inelastic, and that makes it so that if you're living in Nebraska and your local factory shuts down, not only do you lose the job, but you lose the equity in your house, and then even if there are new jobs available in Silicon Valley, you can't possibly afford to live there. And so you stay in Nebraska and you go on unemployment and then you retire. And of course, the other aspect of that is that when housing supplies are so restricted, when you have large investments into the real estate market, rather than leading to just, more houses, more building, they lead to just large increases in house prices. So how does housing and real estate fit into that story?
Yeah, it's really complicated is the answer. I think it definitely has a role in what happened. I think you're right. There's a lot of different issues in there. So yes, in Boston, New York, San Francisco, we've seen soaring real estate prices in part because the markets are soaring, the incomes of the people are soaring, the income inequality is soaring. Tech is really driving in those locations. When you look at where the housing build out was in the housing boom, it's really in 4 states: Texas, Arizona, Florida. It's not really as widespread. And when you look at housing construction, somebody has, I forget who, looked very carefully at the housing markets between those which are restricted and those that weren't. I think it was Meehan and Sufi might have done some of that work. But, you really saw that there was a big rise in subprime mortgages, even in locations where there was no reason to expect any housing increase, because basically you could build an unlimited amount of housing in places like Arizona. And nevertheless, in subprime neighborhoods, you saw a lot of subprime borrowing. So there's a lot of disconnects in there besides just the story that you told. But I would say this, which is I do think what the David Autor work shows us, and I said this earlier, which is I believe that in the Rust Belt where I grew up, there's a big brain drain, and that the most talented people have moved to the coast. And I do think and that a lot of the people who are left are now working on jobs for offshore workers, products and factories for offshore workers. And so those people are reduced from where they were part of a very capital-intensive kind of world economy, and their productivity was driven up by thoughtful manufacturing engineers and a lot of capital investments. Those things have been stripped away, and now they're left waiters waiting on waiters. They're kind of waiting on themselves. And I think when you dig into the economics of immigration and such, and where Perry and Card and a lot of these guys underlying their arguments is this notion that the economy is really kind of serving itself. We're all really just waiters waiting on waiters. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I do think that capital investment and brain power drive up the productivity of workers and ultimately drive up the wages. I think they assume that the mix stays the same. They assume that the capital is unconstrained because generation of workers have saved up the money to put in one more restaurant seat. And so I think if you think we're already down at waiters waiting on waiters' wages, then the brain drain that occurs in the Middle East has no effect. But I think if you look at the David Card work, they will admit, in the Perry work, these guys will admit two things. One is, if there are constraints to growth, then spreading it over more low-skilled workers will reduce the productivity of the workers and ultimately reduce the wages. They say, yeah, but there's no constraint on savings. Look, they're sitting on the sideline unused at zero interest rate. Clearly, capital is not a constraint to growth. I argue, yeah, that's not the constraint to growth. The constraint is willingness and capacity to take risk and properly train talent. And those things are now missing in the Midwest, for example. And the second thing they say is they admit that they can't look at the counterfactual. So even though wages may not have gone down over the last 30 years, we don't know what would have happened to wages under a different scenario. I don't think it's enough to say, oh, wages didn't fall, because everyone's complaining that they haven't gotten a pay increase for 30 years. That what they want is growth equal to what they had seen in the past. So I do think there's some, I'm kind of rambling on here, but I do think there's some loopholes in this. And what you should expect is, why should the worker have to move to San Francisco, where the real estate prices might be high, in order to be a waiter serving on, say, the rich, high-tech people? Why isn't there an entrepreneur coming to Indiana to say, oh, there's this great workforce here, and I'm going to put that workforce back to work? Because remember, talented workers do really three things. One is they innovate, even more so today, I think, in the past because of the lottery-like economics I talked about. The second is they can be doctors, they can be lawyers, they can basically be, conductors, engineers, and conductors on the train. They keep the train moving, they keep it going. And the third is that they can organize unskilled workers into companies that serve customers better and that increase the productivity of the low-skilled workers and ultimately give them higher wages. And I think what you're seeing in this economy, I'll throw you one more fact, which is pretty shocking. The United States, 25% of the workforce scores in the top one-third on academic tests. About 45% of the workforce in the United States scores in the lower third. In Germany, it's a third, a third, a third. And in Japan, it's 50% in the top third, 25% in the bottom third. So the difference between high and low skilled workers in the United States, the ratio goes from 1 to 2 in the United States to 2 to 1 in Japan. There's a 4 times difference between us and everyone else. Now, luckily, we have an ultra-motivated pool of high-skilled workers, and we have institutional capabilities which greatly, greatly increase their productivity relative to their counterparts in Europe and Japan. But what we should expect is the following, which is we have a real shortage of high-skilled workers in the United States relative to most other economies. Then we get these lottery-like innovation opportunities which pull a disproportionate number of people towards that. Even if the returns aren't good, you should expect to see, and we do see, high wages for doctors and people like that who are working in this second segment, which is largely just keeping the gears the oiled and the machine running, because there's a shortage of high-skilled workers. And then what we really find is a shortage of high-skilled workers who are willing to roll up their sleeves and supervise and organize and teach and train and develop capabilities for low-skilled workers to service customers more effectively. In many cases, like the innovators in California, just go, why should I bother to do that? Okay, all the values in lottery-like innovation and in the engineering piece of it, I just outsource everything to Foxconn and to Asia and to China and let them deal with that low value-added piece. And you've got the capital-intensive companies like Ford and Whirlpool and Carrier saying, why in the world would I build this with $15 or $20, $25 an hour labor when I can build it for high-quality $8 an hour labor in Mexico? So the thing that we're not seeing, which is, I think, overwhelming relative to the real estate story, is we don't see these highly skilled entrepreneurial risk takers moving into those communities that have been displaced, where there is labor, which has been reduced to waiter waiting on waiter wages, and organizing that work, that those workers, and putting them back to work in a way that increases their productivity and increases their wages. And I think part of what you see there is, don't forget, in manufacturing, we were able to achieve productivity gains at a much faster rate in manufacturing than we were in services. And then we got opened up to the world of where you can float $1 of labor on a boat around the world at almost no cost. It made no sense where you can float work on a boat to make it here in the United States at $20 an hour. All that work moved overseas. To the extent it stayed in the United States, it put enormous competitive pressure, and we saw a huge increase in productivity through automation and such, and specialization, and businesses never getting started in the first place, like electronics, which just grew overseas as opposed to ever really getting started here. I almost forget where I am in this rant, but what I'm saying is we saw a shift to services, and so now somebody has to go to Indiana and say, I am going to organize workers into services, but those services are largely services for the workers who are left there, and there's no input of brain power and capital that will going to drive the wages back up to where they were, and the productivity gains there are much slower than they are over in the manufacturing sector. It's just much harder to supervise and get those. It has proven, let's say empirically proven, to be difficult in services, even though they're the highest productive service worker is probably 3 times more productive than the lower skilled person doing the exact same job. So the productivity gains are there to be had, but they require a tremendous amount of supervision and recruiting and training and such in order to get it. But I just think you're living in this economy where I'm trying to outline the forces which are causing slow middle and working class wage growth, they should be able to overcome real estate because somebody should be willing to move to Indiana and put everybody back to work. There should be the opportunistic entrepreneur who finds that. But my argument in the book is that is the constraint to growth. That is the binding constraint. That's where the shortage is, and that's why we don't see people moving back there to take advantage of it. And the effect of it is slow and middle class productivity and wage growth.
Right. That would seem to be quite the mystery. You have a place like Indiana where if a firm were to set up there, not only would it face less regulation costs than it would in California, but there's this pool of workers that are maybe you could buy at a deep discount if they've been recently unemployed by trade shocks or technology. That's kind of a tough nut to crack.
But if you can't ship the product out to somebody else, then you just have the guys in Indiana servicing the guys in Indiana. It's all local services for local people. That's going to get to some level of wages, depending on what level of productivity we can achieve. The level that they were at before, where they were producing product for the entire country, for the entire world, was a higher level of productivity and ultimately a higher wage, which would pass through every aspect of every sector of the economy in that location.
So a lot of your book is dedicated to debunking myths that arisen about the economy. One of them is that the idea that investment opportunities are in short supply. So do you want to elaborate on that? Or why do people believe that there are so few investment opportunities?
Well, I think you have the Larry Summers of the world, secular stagnation. They look at the pool of savings, which is sitting on the sideline unused at a zero interest rate. And they say clearly there is a shortage of investment opportunities because there's nobody coming along to borrow that money and put it back to work, invested in capital intensive opportunities. And so the conclusion is there's a shortage of investment opportunities. And what Larry Summers wants to do is borrow that money and build infrastructure with it. What he doesn't tell you is it would only work if that increases government spending overall, because ultimately you have to borrow more money, invest that money, and put it to work. So he's trying to solve the same problem I'm trying to solve, which is how do you put the risk-averse savings to work? I'm trying to solve it by clamping down on the trade deficit as a way to cut it off as its source, as opposed to having to increase government spending at a time when we're at 36% of GDP and rising. And from my view of the world, when you see risk-taking and talent as the binding constraint, it doesn't matter who spends the money. If the government spends the money building infrastructure, it's going to consume our capacity to take risk by borrowing money. It's going to consume properly trained talent to supervise these construction projects. And so to the extent it consumes the constrained resources, we're just going to see an offset in the private sector. I do not believe that increasing government spending from 36 to 38% of GDP is somehow going to make the economy grow faster. I think what he wants you to do is simply think of infrastructure investing in a vacuum, where you say, yeah, if I could dig a tunnel to New Jersey and it increased everybody's productivity, that would be that could potentially be a good investment opportunity. I think, even though I'm skeptical of that, I would say to the extent we're just displacing $1 of government spending with a more effective way to spend it, sure, it's a more effective way to spend it. I think what he doesn't tell you, again, is you got to increase government spending, and that's going to consume constrained resources. So the argument I make is, look, the problem is we don't have investment opportunities that need risk-averse savings. And Larry's right about that, and I think that Summers is right about the fact that before the recession, we didn't have any really good investment opportunities either. It's not like that was used to build capital-intensive businesses in the United States. It largely funded subprime consumption here, Greek consumption in Europe, empty apartment buildings in China on the margin. It did all these things. We won't really have a use in our information-intensive economy for these risk-averse savings. Meanwhile, when I talk to other people, if you go to Silicon Valley, they would say, geez, I'm under tremendous assault by emerging technology. And you see, for example, tech companies like Google and Facebook. Let's take Facebook as an example. First, Instagram was a major threat. Now Snapchat is a major threat to Instagram. I look at my daughter. She's using Snapchat all day long. She's not even using her Instagram account anymore. She never even started to use Facebook. So what you see are these tech companies saying there's so much risk to my business that I can't simply depend on internal development as the only source of new idea generation. I have to have money sitting on the sidelines in order to maximize the value of my company so that I can buy the emerging threats to my business. Now, I'm not saying that policymakers should allow them to buy the emerging threats to their business. I'd rather see more competition than less. But I think in these cases, you see these companies not only pouring money into research and development projects, but also mitigating some of their risks by leaving it on the sidelines. And you look at the top 15 companies in 2000, tech companies in 2000, they've lost 60% of their value, and they'd lose even more if it wasn't for Microsoft, which is the only one of those companies that's still around today. Meanwhile, you've seen 15 brand new competitors emerge over the last 16 years, completely replacing the top 15, not completely because you still have Microsoft in there and probably one or two others, but largely replacing all of those companies. Many of these companies you never even heard of in 2000. So what you see is a lot of turmoil. You see a much shorter period of time for companies on the Fortune 500 list. You see a lot of these companies try to mitigate the risk from all this investment opportunity, or at least this bubbling up of technology, disruptive technology that we're seeing in the space. You see tremendous anxiety on the part of the workers who think robots are going to replace them, et cetera. You do see productivity slowing down. I would argue that when you bang up against your capacity to take risk, when you bang up against your properly trained talent, when you start to work on these lotteries instead of organizing unskilled workers into more productive institutions, that for all of these reasons, you are going to see a potential slowdown in productivity. I think when you look over the long run, though, you see the internet is converging on consciousness and artificial intelligence for genetic engineering. We're probably going to re-engineer humans before this is all over. We might see enormous productivity gains over the long run, even though they might come at a slower, even if they come at a slower pace, we probably still are going to see some very large and disruptive gains going forward in the future. And the same thing I hear when I talk to CEOs is most of them say, I don't have the luxury of just having an unlimited number of ultra-skilled workers to solve all the threats and all the opportunities I see. Quite the contrary, I'm pruning off opportunities to adjust to the fact that I have a difficult time getting the workers that I need to either implement the opportunities or to work to avoid disruption from the threats that I'm seeing. I think you see every company stretched thin in this regard, not having the luxury of talented workers sitting on the sideline and a dearth of investment opportunities, which is not to say that just sticking into your core business is necessarily going to be the way to accelerate growth in this economy. I don't think it is, but I think a lot of companies have to move out of their core, and it's very, very risky, and they don't have the capacity and the willingness to take that risk. I also think trade deficit, which 3.5% of GDP, brings risk-averse savings into our economy, and they say I'm happy to fund investment, but I'm not willing to underwrite or bear any of the risk that goes along with that investment. Somebody else has to bear that risk. So who are logical people to bear that risk? One would be rich people who borrow against their assets and invest the money. You can lose all your money by levering up that way. I think most people would say, I'm willing to invest my assets, but I'm not willing to take the risk of losing everything in order to get an incremental couple points of return and put all those risk-averse savings. So historically, they have not borrowed the money. If you look at companies, they have turned from cash flow negative in the 70s when we were capital intensive and manufacturing intensive and growing to cash flow positive today. So on net, they're contributing more to the savings than they're consuming in the savings. We found subprime homeowners with poor credit ratings and said, I don't know if you knew this, but you won the lottery. Your house is actually worth a lot of money. I found this foreign investor who's willing to bear the risk of your 20% down payment by buying the subordinated tranche in a securitization, the 20% subordinated tranche in a securitization. How'd you like to take the money out and spend it and party? You're never going to see that much money ever again anyway, so your credit rating's already pretty bad, so why wouldn't you take that risk? Right now, your equity's in the home at risk. So one risk, the other risk, how much difference is there? And so naturally you saw a lot of people run and get that money. It doesn't really grow the economy. It doesn't increase wages. It doesn't grow productivity to just have we won the lottery spending extravaganza. You get a one-time pop from that unless it's sustainable, and it's not. And so we don't really have any use for these risk-averse savings, and that's because the people that have the collateral, the homeowners, the rich homeowners, rich people with assets, don't want to bear that risk. Why? Because we're bumping up against our capacity and our willingness to take risk. What is their capacity to take risk? It's largely the amount of equity we have. It's a little more esoteric and complicated than that, but you can have the capacity but not have the willingness, and you can have the willingness but nobody will lend you the money because you don't have high quality collateral to satisfy the risk-averse savers that don't want to take any risk. So you have to put up collateral that protects them. And you have to have the collateral, and you have to be willing to put it up. We have a lot of the collateral. We're unwilling to put it up. And so the more risk-averse savings which come flowing in as a result of the trade deficit, or fear of the unknown after the financial crisis, or if you're in a startup and you've got all your eggs in one basket, and even though you do face a tremendous amount of unsystematic risk, you may very well say, I'm going to hold money in cash in order to mitigate that unsystematic risk, that undiversified risk that I face, and that money is going to sit in cash as an offset to the risk-taking that's occurring in other sectors of the economy. All of that leads to an imbalance, which doesn't say we have a shortage of investment opportunities. It says we have a shortage of we're bumping into our willingness and capacity to take risks that are needed to put those savings back to work.
So what are some policy things that we could do to increase our capacity to take risk?
One of the things the answer to that is lower taxes, lower marginal taxes would allow us to accumulate equity faster. It seems crazy that when we finally do get some equity, do accumulate some equity, that the person dies. We want to have an estate tax and tax, redistribute, and consume the equity that we've been lucky enough to have created. I think when we get these pockets of equity, we want to recognize them as very, very precious assets in the modern economy. I'm very reluctant about reducing tax rates without reducing government spending because I think you run up huge deficits. I think it takes a long time to build the institutional capabilities that are needed to grow faster. So I don't think Europe can cut its tax rate and suddenly start growing faster because it doesn't have the institutional capabilities to compete in the modern economy. It takes decades for the U.S. to do that. So one of the things I propose is lowering the corporate tax rate to 15% because that's the primary investment vehicle in the United States, and then reluctantly offsetting that with an increase in the personal capital gains rate back to ordinary income. It's not a full offset, it's a partial offset, but to bring back some of the tax revenues. I think that would lower corporate tax rates, at least in the international sector of economy, would make those companies more competitive. They already have 15% tax rates, which they do through leaving the money overseas and loaning it back through banks back to themselves to buy back stock. It's a very complicated, convoluted thing that we're doing to allow them to be down into 15% tax rate. It would be wise for us, I think, to just admit that it's really 15%, and it's more logical that it would be at 15%. I think there's studies that show that the less you tax the return on capital, the more investment you're likely to see and get, the higher wages, the higher productivity you're likely to get as well. So that's one of the things I would do. I think it's probably a far cry, but to the extent you can cut government spending, I think you'd see a rise in the private sector, which put those constrained resources back to work. The main proposal I do make in the book for growth, which skirts around all of these problems, is just go out and recruit another 5 million top 5% workers from the rest of the world. There's 7 billion people in the world, 5% non-Americans, 5% 350 million. Half of them, we don't know who they are. Half are too young and too old. Half are never going to move. You get down to a pool of about 50 million people who, if you could get 5 of those 50 million, gradually over time and put them into our institutional capabilities, which make those workers way more productive than they can be elsewhere, and you lower the marginal tax rate to 15%, I think you've created a business environment in the United States which cannot really be duplicated anywhere else in the world for international competition, international producers like the Googles, Facebook, Intels, Microsofts of the world, which are the highest quality, fastest growing jobs in the world. If you're in the local services business, you're obviously going to have to be in the local service economy, and if you're in the floating unskilled labor on a boat, you're going to be wherever the cheapest unskilled labor is. Asia, Mexico, Eastern Europe, if where production costs matter. You want to be adjacent to whatever market you're serving. But I think those are the things that we could do, given the constraints to today's economy, that would accelerate growth as fast as we're able to accelerate, which I suspect is a little, not a lot.
My guest today has been Ed Conard. Ed, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Sure, thank you. I hope I didn't rant on there too long on some of those things.
It was great.